150 people, given 1 month to leave and told they'd be allowed home once the war was over. They never were. 80 years on, their front doors are still locked and nobody's coming back to open them. Forget the postcard version of Britain. Behind the hedgerows and the National Trust car parks, there's another country entirely. One made of muddy footpaths, army checkpoints and villages the map still shows, even though nobody's lived there in decades. You won't find these on a coach tour. You need a raincoat, a pair of proper boots, and a reason to go looking. These are 5 of Britain's most haunting abandoned villages and the very different disasters that emptied every one of them. Start on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire at a village called Imber. It's been there since the Domesday Book, a proper English village with a church, a pub, and farms that had worked the same fields for generations. Then, in November 1943, with D-Day months away, the army needed somewhere to train troops for street fighting in occupied Europe. They picked Imber. The entire population, around 150 people, was given just 47 days to pack up and leave, and told it was temporary, just for the war effort. The war ended. The villagers never got their homes back. The Ministry of Defence still owns Imber today, still uses it for training, and only opens the road through a handful of days a year, when you can walk streets that have been frozen since 1943, past a church that still holds services once a summer for the families who were never allowed to stay. Down on the Dorset coast, a similar story played out at Tyneham. In December 1943, this seaside valley village was requisitioned by the army for tank and artillery training ahead of the D-Day landings. Villagers were given a month's notice and left a handwritten note pinned to the church door, asking that the men of England who'd taken their homes to win the war treat the church and cottages kindly. They believed they'd be home within a year. Instead, a compulsory purchase order made the loss permanent after the war ended. Tyneham is open to walkers most weekends now, and you can wander past roofless cottages and a schoolroom still laid out with old desks, sitting in a valley that's been slowly swallowed by grass and ivy for 80 years. Head into North Wales now, and the cause of the tragedy changes completely. This time, it wasn't a war that emptied the village, it was a tap in Liverpool. In the Tryweryn Valley sat Capel Celyn, a small, tight-knit, Welsh-speaking farming community of about 67 people, built around a chapel, a school, and a post office that had served the valley for generations. In 1957, Liverpool City Council put a private bill through the Westminster Parliament to dam the valley and build a reservoir, supplying water not to Wales, but to the industry and homes of Liverpool and the Wirral, across the border in England. 35 out of 36 Welsh members of Parliament voted against the bill. It passed anyway. For the villagers of Capel Celyn, that meant something almost unthinkable, digging up their own dead. Before the valley was flooded, families had to exhume the graves in the chapel cemetery and rebury their relatives on higher ground, so the bodies wouldn't be left underwater. When the reservoir, Llyn Celyn, was officially opened in October 1965, the ceremony was disrupted by protesters, and the event is still remembered across Wales as a symbol of a community's home being sacrificed for someone else's convenience. You'll still see the phrase, Carfouch Dryweryn, meaning remember Tryweryn, painted on walls across the country to this day, and when a serious drought drops the water level far enough, the old stone walls, gateposts, and the humped pack-horse bridge of Capel Celyn rise back out of the reservoir, dripping and silent, for a few weeks at a time, before the rain comes back and swallows the village all over again. On the South Devon coast sits Hall Sands, a fishing village that didn't lose a vote in Parliament. It lost a fight with the sea, and lost it because of a decision made a few miles up the coast. Hall Sands was a working village of around 159 people, built precariously along a narrow ledge at the base of a cliff, protected from the open water by a wide, deep bank of shingle that had piled up along the shoreline for centuries. In the 1890s, the Royal Navy needed to extend its dockyard at Keyham, near Plymouth, and a contractor was granted permission to dredge hundreds of thousands of tons of that shingle straight off the beach in front of the village to make concrete. Villagers protested almost immediately. They could see the beach visibly dropping, sometimes by more than a metre in a single year. But the dredging continued for several years before it was finally stopped. By then, the damage was already done. With the natural sea defence gone, the seawall that had always stood safely above the waves now stood directly exposed to them. Storms began chipping away at the foundations of the houses themselves. Then, on the night of the 26th of January 1917, a ferocious easterly gale combined with an unusually high tide, and the sea came straight through the village. By morning, all but one of the 29 houses in Hallsands were uninhabitable, or gone entirely, swept into the channel. Remarkably, no one died that night, but the village, for all practical purposes, was finished. One resident, Elizabeth Prettyjohn, refused to leave the ruins and lived alone among the wreckage of her home for decades afterward. Today, the remains of Hallsands are fenced off as unsafe, crumbling a little further into the sea with every winter storm, a permanent reminder of what happens when you quietly remove the thing that was protecting you the whole time. Last stop is the strangest one, because you can't actually walk into it. You'd need to swim. Off the Suffolk coast lies Dunwich, once a medieval port city genuinely rivaling London in size and importance, with a population of around 10,000 people at its height in the 13th century, complete with multiple churches, monasteries, a mint, and a busy harbour trading with continental Europe. Its downfall wasn't sudden. It took centuries, but it was relentless. A series of catastrophic storms, the worst known as the Great Drowning of Men in 1362, tore away huge sections of the harbour and coastline, and swept whole streets into the sea in a single night. The process never really stopped after that. Church after church toppled over the eroding cliff edge across the following centuries, the last of them finally collapsing into the waves in the early 20th century. And the coastline is still crumbling backward even now, a metre or more some years. What used to be the heart of Dunwich now sits entirely underwater, roughly 1.5 miles offshore, making it, according to marine archaeologists who've spent decades mapping it with sonar, in near-zero visibility water. The largest medieval town site submerged anywhere in Europe. Local legend has always insisted that on a still night, if the tide is right, you can still hear the muffled ringing of Dunwich's church bells beneath the waves, tolling for a city that isn't there anymore. Nobody has ever proven that part. Nobody's ever fully disproven it either. And honestly, standing on that quiet, crumbling stretch of Suffolk coastline with nothing but marshland and a shingle beach in front of you, it's easy to believe it anyway. If you actually want to see any of this yourself, none of it requires a permit, a boat, or a death wish. Just a bit of planning. Imber only opens its roads to the public on a handful of days each year, mostly around Easter and in August, when the Ministry of Defence isn't using the plane for live training, so check the dates before you drive out. Tyneham is far easier, open to walkers most weekends and bank holidays, with a car park at the top of the valley and a gentle track down past the cottages to a shingle beach at Warbarrow Bay. Capel-Celyn itself is gone for good under Lyn-Celyn, but there's a memorial and a viewpoint over the reservoir near the dam, and if you time a visit during a dry summer, local news will usually report when the old walls have resurfaced. Hallsands has a signed coast path from the nearby village of Beesands, with a viewing platform looking down onto the ruins, since the site itself is far too dangerous to walk into. And Dunwich is the easiest of all to reach, just a shingle beach and a small museum in the current village, with the old churchyard's last remaining headstones perched right on the crumbling cliff edge. Close enough that you can still read the names on some of them for now. There's a particular kind of quiet in a village that people were forced out of, rather than one they simply left. Standing in Imber or Tyneham, or knee-deep in the mud where Capelcelyn's chapel used to stand, or on the shingle above the drowned bells of Dunwich, you're not just looking at old stone. You're standing in the middle of a decision someone else made for these people, decades or centuries ago, that they never got to undo. Britain doesn't advertise these places. There's no gift shop waiting at the end of the track. No polished visitor centre explaining what happened in 5 easy bullet points. Most of the time, there's just a locked gate, a weathered information board nobody reads twice, and the wind moving through grass that used to be someone's front garden. That's the whole appeal, really. These villages weren't preserved on purpose. They were simply left behind. By an army that never gave the land back. By a parliament that voted against an entire nation. By a sea that quietly took back what was always technically its own. Find them, and you're not visiting a museum. You're trespassing, gently, on somebody else's unfinished ending.